So thank you all for coming today on the last day of the conference and on the second to last presentation. I appreciate that you're still here and not out having fun in Bulgaria. So I'm going to talk today. This is kind of an outline of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to start by kind of describing and defining what nosatsu or senjafuda are, and then talk a little bit about the history of the practice of pasting and exchanging these kind of slips or placards was from around late 1800 to 1930, so kind of late Edo to early Showa. And then I'm going to talk about how the University of Oregon, which is our collection is fairly small, but we are lucky to have maybe definitely one of the largest collections of these kinds of things, probably in the world. So this is our claim to fame, I guess. Really showing teki mono desu ne, kedo. And then talk about how the digitization project to make these available publicly, and then some of the future plans we have surrounding these kinds of materials. So I promise I'm not going to read anything else but these two quotes, and because they get really to the essence of what these things are. The first one is by Frederick Starr, and we'll talk a little bit more about him later. And it's a paper that was based on his talk that he gave at the Asiatic Society of Japan in 1917. So he writes, "Nosatsu definitely attracted my attention the first time that I visited Asakusa. Everywhere we saw slips of paper bearing printed characters pasted up at gateways, shrines, and temples. They were stuck up on neo, pasted in inaccessible corners, plastered in quantities upon miserable little shrines. They were clearly significant. Such careful and beautiful lettering as they showed was not to be seen on every bit of printed paper." He goes on to write that he was so intrigued and curious about these kinds of these materials he was seeing, stuck on temples and shrines. And he started to ask his acquaintances, Japanese acquaintances, and no one could give him an answer. And it took him a while to finally get at what these actually are. The second quote is from Professor Glenn Wally. He's a early modern Japanese culture and literature at the University of Oregon. And he received funding 3 or 4 years ago to put together a digital exhibition of nosatsu, particularly yokai in nosatsu. So there's a link to it later in the presentation. So if you're interested, please take a look at that. And the reason I'm quoting him is he really concisely, in a few sentences, gets to the essence of what these things are. So he writes, "The phenomenon of senjafuda dates back to the 18th century. They were originally made by pilgrims to paste on the walls of shrines and temples as a sort of devotional graffiti. Later, they became collector's items, and by the middle of the 19th century, they had become miniature masterpieces of woodblock printed art. Senjafuda depict a dizzying variety of themes with meticulous craftsmanship and vivid, stylish graphic design." So I hope that gives you a sort of understanding of what we're going to talk about. The next sort of distinction is between the black and white monochrome slip on the left-hand side, which actually, it says Frederick Starr, Beikoku Stadu. And this is what you would use to paste on the walls of shrines and temples. And then the one on the right is one of the very colorful kokan fuda, so exchange fuda. So what happened over time, probably go back. So what happened over time was that during the, let me get to that later. So here's an example of a nosatsu, but the contemporary in Japan as of last year. I took these in Aizu Wakamatsu. I was kind of surprised to see that they were that far away from Tokyo because it's kind of a Edo-centric practice. But you can see, I'm sure anyone who's ever been to Japan has seen these before. And I kind of had the same reaction Star did, and like, what are these things? Here's kind of a chronology of the history of nosatsu. So it started around 1800. It was partly fueled by the boom in travel for recreation during this time. So people would go out in groups, and they would have their kind of toolbox that had glue and other materials. And then they'd have what's the word for it? like a kind of pasting rod that you could expand and make like 10 feet long or so. And they would try to paste it in out of inaccessible places and hard to reach places. And as people were going out doing this, they started to exchange their harifuda with other pasting groups. And then this led to the formation of nosatsukai. And these were groups in Edo that met regularly and usually had a theme for the meeting. And each member of the group would commission an artist, a carver, a printer to produce a unique nosatsu. And then they would go to the meetings, and if, say, the group had 100 people, they would have 100 slips. And so by the end of the meeting, everyone would have 100 distinctive slips. And usually, from what I can tell, they took those home and they pasted them in albums. And this is what we have at the collection at the U of O. So after the Meiji Restoration, with the turn towards rejecting everything that was that stunk of Edo, I guess, the practice of doing nosatsu, like a lot of other Edo period practices, almost died out. So that lasted for about 15 years. And then around 1890 to around 1930, we have the revival of nosatsu traditions, and also the arrival of Frederick Starr in Japan, who became engaged with this practice. At the same time, sort of overlapping, a printer in Yokohama named, he went by the pen name of, or daimei of, Shobundo. He was active in these groups, and I'll talk more about him later. Finally, in 1939, Gertrude Bass Warner at the University of Oregon purchased these materials from Frederick Starr's sister, and that's how they came to be at the University of Oregon. We started digitizing the collection in 2015, and it's going to be a long slog to get the whole thing digitized. In 2017, we received a significant donation called the Shobundo collection, which I'll talk more about later. And then we also in 2020 purchased 4 albums from an American businessman who was in Japan in the 1920s. So here's a little bit more like what I just mentioned, but so in the 19th century, pasting became really popular amongst commoners, and groups would go out pasting on shrines and temples. And then nosatsukai formed, and as I said, individuals would commission artists, printers, and carvers to produce a unique slip. And so you can see in the image here, this is an example of someone going out pasting with his pole on a shrine gate. And the next slide shows what the meetings were like. So they're actually really, the individuals who are in these nosatsukai groups are quite competitive. And you can see it when you look through the albums, there's obviously an effort to outdo their fellow group members. And there's quite a lot of excitement going on at this event. Looks like one of the members is quite popular. His nosatsu was really interesting. This was actually done by the Hiroshige, the original Hiroshige. And as I mentioned, so after the Meiji Restoration, when there was a turn against Edo, Edo was seen as retrograde and backwards, whereas the Meiji officials, politicians, were trying to move Japan towards westernization and modernization. Edo period practices got left behind. And here are just some nosatsu images that sort of illustrate that. On the left-hand side, this is a really interesting series in our collection. As I'll talk about later, most of the images the themes are based on Edo culture, like folk toys, festivals, Hakkenden, Shushingura, Kabuki, things like that. But there's one series that's really interesting, and there's a few others that cover modern Japan, modern at that time. So there's one series that runs from like 1868 to 1930, showing kind of a history of the Meiji period up to the early Showa period in these nosatsu slips. So you can see one of the slips says Chomage Kinshi, so he's getting that cut off. And then on the bottom, there's a guy getting I guess a Western style haircut. And then the other slide shows, or the other image shows the creation of the Japanese national flag, and then the beginning of the postal service in Japan. And the other two, I think, they're nosatsu, but I think they're replica of Yokohama A, ukiyo-e, from an earlier period. So around about 1890, there was kind of a backlash against the rapid modernization. There was a look backwards to see Edo as actually sort of the heart of Japanese culture, as a kind of the incubator of what was becoming a national culture. So there was kind of this a conflict between the people that were looking backwards towards Edo and the people that were moving towards modernization. And you see this in things like there were the kind of development of these cultural networks of antique and toy collectors and other people that were into the appreciation of traditional tattooing. And at the same time, because of this resurgence in Edo period tradition revival, I guess, nosatsu practices started up again. And there was also a kind of Edo boom at this time, including within that a genroku boom. So like there were department stores were advertising kimono patterns based on the genroku period, hairstyles. And you can see that in the image at the bottom. There's it's kind of oh yeah, Genroku Dansu that was created by a department store manager in Tokyo. And then there was, at the same time, there was this Tokyo Tricentennial, which really was a commemoration of Ieyasu coming to Edo. And you can see how it's kind of conflicted, because the people that were looking back towards Edo wanted to call it the Edo period tricentennial, but then there were the government officials and politicians who wanted it to be called the Tokyo Tricentennial, which really doesn't make a lot of sense because it really wasn't. So, and this is Frederick Starr, and so he came along right at the same time that this was all happening, where the Edo period traditions were coming back. I think he originally came to Japan in 1904, and he came back to Japan many times up until his death, actually in Tokyo in 1933. And he was a professor of anthropology at the University of Chicago, by all rights, an eccentric. In fact, the biography of him calls him, it's called something like Frederick Starr, a genuine eccentric. So he came to Japan. He got involved in all like folk toy collecting, antique collecting. He climbed Mount Fuji several times. He did the Shikoku pilgrimage a few times. His trip down the Tokaido was documented by the Asahi Shimbun. And every time he arrived in a town or city, people were there to wait him with flags and greet him. But he was, at the time, maybe one of the most popular or well-known kind of gaijin talento. So his presence in the nosatsu practices, I think, really in some ways gave it a sort of raised the status by having a Western anthropologist or professor taking part in all of these events dressed in hakama and full Japanese regalia. And so along with the revival of Edo practices, his participation sort of fueled the growth of interest in nosatsu as well. And this is how this came to be at the University of Oregon. Frederick Starr passed away in, I think, 1933, and his sister in Seattle inherited his many objects. And around about the same time, Gertrude Bass Warner was founding the U of O's Art Museum. And she was a wealthy American woman who traveled extensively in East Asia in the late 1890s, early 1900s, and she was collecting a lot of art with a focus on Japanese art. So I guess that Lucy Starr found out about her interest in Asian art and Asian materials, and she contacted her. And you can see on this slide, there's some correspondence between Lucy Starr and Gertrude Bass Warner. Eventually, after they corresponded for about 2 or 3 years, Warner purchased, or the U of O purchased the collection for $250. It more or less stayed kind of hidden in the U of O's archives and special collections. At one point, it was separated into two collections with all the loose slips going into the museum and all the album like book-like things staying in the library, which is where we've been working on them. And this is where I'm trying to connect to the title a little bit with the kind of echoes of Edo. Most of the themes in the collection are based on Edo period motifs. So you've got the Namazue and the like Ebisu, and then a Daimyo Gyoretsu, a tofu kozo, tofu boy, image of a yokai. And this last image is purportedly the founder or the originator of the practice of pasting no satsu. And then some street performers, kabuki, an image from the Hakkenden, Edo period firefighters, some kind of, I guess, gags or tricks, and then pilgrimages. And if anybody's read or seen Glenn Wally's translation of the Hakkenden, I think there's 2 volumes out now. Both covers are from our collection showing the Hakkenden. So in 2015 to 2018, with funding from a national resource center grant that the Center for Asian and Pacific Studies had gotten, not specifically for this collection, but there was a lot of money at the U of O at that time. So 40 of the albums were digitized and then cataloged and uploaded to the Oregon Digital Archive, which is an archive maintained and by the University of Oregon and Oregon State University. And then just last year, we received the Perla Carl Lowe Award, and 7 more albums have been scanned, and we're working on doing enhanced metadata cataloging. And so you can see this is an image of the Tokaido done by the Goju Sansugi by Hiroshige in, I think it's from 1848. And you can see one is just a page of what it looks like in the album it's in, and the other is images of what it looks like in Oregon Digital. I don't know if you can read the subject headings, but this is one thing I really want to point out is that, so these things, as I said, have metadata, but for reasons that were beyond my control, the person who was hired to do the metadata was a graduate student assistant with a focus in European art history. So the basic metadata is really good, but it tends to be things like men or river or house or temple. There's nothing specific about Japan because she wasn't versed in that kind of background. So as I mentioned, one of the challenges of this is trying everything. All 40 of these albums are in Oregon Digital with over 9,000 individual images, but there's almost no way to find anything because you can't. The subject headings are too broad. So what actually the Japanese studies cataloger, who's actually my wife too, Kumiko McDowell, and I have been working to start adding Japanese subject headings to these images. So that's going to be a long time project, as I'll mention later. And so this is an example of something we have done. So last year I went in and I added LC link data for subject headings for the Great Kanto earthquake, 1923 subject heading, to all of the images in our collection that depict that event. So you can see at the top is like a keyword search for Kanto earthquake. And then the results on the right-hand side show you some newspaper articles and then all of the nosatsu that have Kanto earthquake as a subject heading. And then the black slide shows the earthquake, the ruins of a 12-story building. But if you can see the other subject headings, they're almost meaningless without the Kanto earthquake subject heading. You could not find these things. The other kind of negative point of these things in Oregon Digital is that I don't understand how the infrastructure works, but there's no way to search through the albums page by page. It's almost impossible actually to search through the albums in any order. So it can be really frustrating. So, which is why we're really getting ready, energetic about, enthusiastic about going to the next level with this. There's just a few more images. The middle images is of what a Nosatsu album looks like. That's the cover, and then Hakenden image, and then some of the scanning, an image of scanning them. And then this is about the 2017 Shobundo collection donation. So the collection was donated by Sato Shiro, who was the son of Sato Masao, also AKA Shobundo. Sato Masao was a printmaker and Nosatsu enthusiast, active in the Showa period to Heisei period. The collection runs from about the same time frame and includes over 50 albums, photographs, and interestingly, it has a pasting pole and also some wood blocks that he printed himself, or he used himself. Oh, the image on the far right, I guess, is of him pasting Nosatsu on a shrine or temple. And then the latest collection we purchased was in early COVID era, so 2021 probably. And this is a really fascinating collection because this W. Egbert Schenk, as I said, an American businessman, he was an acquaintance of Starr, and Starr was the one who introduced him to someone who took him to two Nosatsu meetings in 1922 and 1923. And what's really fascinating about this is because Schenk was quite enthusiastic and interested in the practice of exchanging Nosatsu, and he wrote an account of his two visits to a Nosatsu exchange meeting. And what's really nice, somebody has written captions for each of the Nosatsu in his collection. So that's really helpful because a lot of times you don't really know exactly what the theme is or what's going on. So that was a nice addition to our collection. And here's some challenges that I've already kind of touched on, that accessing images in Oregon Digital is very difficult. So it makes adding metadata very frustrating sometimes because it would be nice to be able to go in and do a whole series at one time on the same theme, but right now that's not possible, although it's a known issue. And then staffing, mainly this is going to be me and Kumiko working on this, but fortunately, recently, about 3 months ago, the U of O hired a digital collections metadata manager. And since they've arrived at the U of O, it's been so helpful to have someone coordinating and helping us systematically do this and document our changes. I think it's going to be a really enhance our work on this. And then funding is always an issue, of course, but so we really don't have any dedicated funding for this kind of thing. It has to come from grants. And it's actually quite expensive to digitize one album, cost about and add metadata cost around $1,000. So it's a lot of money. I do want to say this is something we're looking forward to. Opportunity or a future project is that, I don't know if people realize this, but Nosatsu exchange meetings still are ongoing. And I think these pictures are at a meeting that Kumiko attended a few years ago. And we've developed a pretty large network of people that do this pasting and exchanging. And but we noticed about a year ago when we were in Japan in November that if you go to temples or shrines around in Tokyo or around Tokyo, in fact, we saw one the first time was in Nagano, but there are these signs in Nagano. I can't think of the name of the major temple that's in Nagano, but they had a sign saying, rather than pasting your Nosatsu, please throw them in this wooden box so we can burn them, I guess, as a ritual, which kind of goes against the grain of what these people were trying to accomplish by putting up their kind of something akin to graffiti, really. But we saw that all over Tokyo after that. A lot of temples had set up like bulletin boards and said, paste them here rather than on the building. So we were talking to some of the people that we've met that do this, and they're worried that this is going to fade away and actually be prohibited at some point. So we're hoping to start doing an oral history project with 15 or so people that are engaged in this practice. And it's really just getting started. I'm hoping to take a sabbatical maybe next year and work on that. So, and thank you. And since Oregon is called the Oregon Ducks.
ありがとうございました。質問のある方いらっしゃいますでしょうか。
Thank you so much for your presentation. I have kind of two questions. One is about your challenges of digitization, making metadata. Specifically, what's the difficulty of making metadata? It's just time or difficult to read or difficult to classify? If you can touch that. Another question I have is, when you have a new acquisition, where are you putting? Are you putting in a special collection? Are you making it as a finding aid or something? I don't know where you are putting as an archive.
You mean the digitized images?
No, the actual nosatsu
Oh, okay. Yes.
collection.
Yeah.
Are you putting in a special collection?
Yeah,
And
they're all in special collections. And then, as I said, the ones that aren't in albums are held in the museum. And
Uh-huh.
so one goal, I don't know if it's probably, I'll be retired before we get to this, but it'd be nice to digitize both collections and have them together again. So the challenges, one of the challenges, as I mentioned, it's really, you can't go page by page, which would be nice for users and for people doing the metadata work. So it's kind of random. So when you go in there, you can find, oh, this is an image showing folk toys. So you can find the subject heading for that and add it. But I know that there's like 10 other images from the same series in that same album, but there's no way to search like that. So it's that issue, which is really frustrating. And it's frustrating for users as well. And then there's time. A lot of the text is done in Kuzushiji. So Kumigo's been going to a lot of workshops and things like that. And also, I should have mentioned this earlier, but we want to start adding Japanese metadata so that we can make this accessible to users in Japan. Right now, it's all English, and I think it's really that's really a block for people trying to use it. Did that answer your question? Thank you. So that's a really good question.
No, thank you so much.
どうもありがとうございました。